Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and a slightly quirky Zoia tutorial for you today. This is based on a what-if scenario that is something that I might never need, but I wanted to find out how to program this particular thing. And the what-if that started this patch is I was wondering, what if I had a MIDI controller that consisted only of a single encoder, like this, but only a single one? And how do I control several things on the Zoia with that single encoder? And the way I envisioned this to work was that I would have a set of buttons. These are the ones lighting up in red here. And I would push one, and then I would set the encoder, and then I would push another one, and I would set the encoder to something else. And then when I went back to the other one, the value would be remembered. Because now I put them to the same value, so you can't see the difference. I'll do like this. And then I would be able to continue where I left off because it sends the value back to the MIDI controller as well. So in order for this to work, actually, the way I have patched it up, you need to have a MIDI controller that both sends a value to the Zoia and can receive one back as well to update the position of the encoder, which of course is a kind of a virtual potentiometer. If you have a mechanical potentiometer, of course, that will not work. And if you have a MIDI controller that doesn't receive MIDI messages to update its status, that does not work. So this is quite a niche thing, but I thought it was a fun thing to try out. And there are, of course, elements in this that might be useful for other kind of patching as well. So I'm just going to explain how this works briefly, if I'm able to do such a thing. As you might know, if you watch my videos, I do go on a bit. I do apologize, but I like being thorough and I like explaining things in detail because I'm not presuming any skill level from my audience now. There might be people who haven't even got a Zoia yet who want to watch this just to see how things work. So I have, as I said earlier, I've got two buttons that are meant to have an associated value to them that is then sent further into the patch wherever those values are needed. Those values are stored in a sample and hold module. I'm only going to show you one of the buttons now, really, because for the second button, all those modules are repeated. And that's this one up here. But before I get to that in detail, I'm going to start with the MIDI in and out. So as you can see, when I turn this thing lights up, and that is the MIDI input that picks up the value that is sent out from this encoder. And that value is sent into an out switch, which I have over here. And then we have, next to it here, we have the MIDI CC output, which sends on the same channel and the same CC back to the Zoia to update the encoder. And that is connected to the output of an in switch. So that's the MIDI in and out part of the patch. And I'll just explain for those who may not be familiar with the Zoia what these switches are. So an out switch, first of all, has a single input and multiple outputs, and also a pad that sets which of the single outputs gets the value sent to it from the input. And only one of these outputs can be active at a time, and that is decided by the value set at or sent to the channel selector pad here. And the in switch works the other way around. It has multiple inputs rather than outputs and a single output. And then the channel selector is the value at the channel selector decides which of these inputs is the only one that is then being sent to the output. Okay. And the way the channel selector works in both cases is the same. Which value selects which channel depends on the number of channels. If you have 10 channels, for instance, your first channel is selected with a value between 0 and 0.1, the second one 0.1 to 0.2, etc. So it divides the value range of 0 to 1 equally between the channels. In this case, we have 3 channels, which means the first one is selected when the channel selector gets an input from 0 to 0.333, and the second channel is selected when it gets a value of 0.334 to 0.666, and the last one when it is above 0.66. Okay, we're clear so far. You may have noticed that we have 3 channels here rather than 2, even though we only have 2 buttons. And the reason is I don't want anything to happen now in my patch when I turn the encoder when nothing is selected. So just to make things easy for myself, I then have channel 1 on this switch be basically a dead channel. So when nothing is connected, it gets the value in, but it isn't connected to anything else, which means nothing happens in the patch really. And just for symmetry, I also did the same on the output as well. So when channel 1 is selected, then nothing happens. So because when you send out, of course, you don't want anything sending out to the output unless channel 2 or 3 are selected, and you don't want anything coming in unless channel 2 or 3 are selected. So buttons here 1 and 2 will control channels 2 and 3 on these switches. Very important little detail. This is perhaps the first point that is useful in terms of general programming on the Zoia. If you use a switch to control where signals go, sometimes you need to have an off stage as well on that, and then of course it's normal to use channel 1 for that, and then everything that's an active thing where something is supposed to happen is when you use channels 2 and upwards. Let's just see what happens when we push a button. So UI buttons is what I've chosen to use here, and the reason I choose UI buttons normally for most things is that you can dynamically change the color of them. So whatever value is sent to the button itself now is the color value. So right now it's 0.0375, which is bright red. Of course, you keep going here, you can get other colors, but I'm keeping it as 0.375, like so. And when you create a UI button, user interface button, you have an additional option that is disabled by default, and that is CV output. But if you want the button to control anything rather than just being visual, then you want to enable the output. UI button is also great just for visual effects, but in this case it is actually a controller, so we want to have an output. You could actually use just momentary switches for this, but I like using UI buttons because it gives me the option of changing colors, and so I just start with that as a default when I do this kind of thing, even though in this case I haven't programmed anything that particularly needs a UI button. So I push this button and lots of things light up here right away, and I'll just push the output here and push shift and the eye icon twice, and then we get a list of the connections here, and as you can see there are 4 connections to this UI button. It's the in switch and the out switch, it's a trigger and a multiplier. So just to do the switches first, you can see that the connection strength here is set to 66.1, and then that is because I needed to select channel 2 on these switches, and then it needs to be between 0.334 and 0.666, as I said earlier, and I like keeping it just below the upper end of the range where it needs to be, and that is because I like the visual feedback of the light being brighter when it is pushed. So this thing lights up more because it has a higher strength. And the equivalent for my second button here is 100%, because this just needs to select the last channel, channel 3 on these switches, and so it just can be 100, give a nice bright feedback, and that is how it works. I'm just gonna go away from that. Right, so that selects channel 2 here on the out switch, and as that's where the signal is coming from the MIDI controller is coming in here, which means that the input here, which is the MIDI value, is then sent to channel 2 here when this button is held down, and it is sent to channel 3 here when this button is held down. So let's look at this button here, or this channel here, I should say, on the out switch. And as you can see, it goes to 3 different places. The first place here is perhaps one of the more important ones, because this is where the value of this associated with this button is kept inside the Zoia patch. This is a sample and hold module. And what a sample and hold does, just for those who may be unfamiliar with it, is it has 3 pads, a highly useful module. You'll use it all the time when you patch the Zoia. It has an input where it can have a changing value, a static value, anything, but the way it works is that it has a trigger, and every time the trigger pad is patched with something that gives it a rising value, it will be triggered, and then and only then will it copy the contents, the value at the input to the output. So very useful module, especially for things that can change all the time. In this case, we have a value that can change all the time, and so we want it to, and we want to store it as well. When we stop moving this, and when we go and do something else in the patch, we want that value to stay here in the sample and hold. So the input for this sample and hold, the value input is from what comes out here. And then we have 2 more modules patched up to it, and this is something I do to detect when there is a change. The thing is that you only want to trigger the sample and hold when something is changing, and you want to trigger it every time something is changing. So first of all, I have here a trigger module. This is also quite a useful thing, a trigger and an inverter, actually, that are coupled together. So the trigger input, and the way trigger works is when it gets a rising value, again, it sends out what's known as a trigger. It just sends out a very quick pulse, single pulse. So if I press this now, you see it lights up with a pulse. A little bit delayed actually, but that's because it goes via the switch now, and yeah. But this one is lighting up faster. That's also a trigger. I'll get back to that one. So this trigger is then triggered by this value here, which comes from here. And the idea is that, as you can see, it lights up every time I increase the value, but also every time I decrease it. And the way I do that is by connecting this channel on the switch also to an inverter. What an inverter does, it outputs the opposite or the negative value of what you send into it. So if this is a positive value, this becomes a negative value, and if this is a negative value, then it becomes a positive value. So the idea is that when this value goes down, this inverter will have a value that goes up. And by patching the inverter into the trigger, that means that this trigger will trigger both when it is increased and when it goes down. If you only patch it into the rising value, into the value itself, it will only trigger when it goes up, but not when it goes down. So you need both to detect when it goes up and when it goes down. So that is how that works. So this is patched into the input of trigger, input of inverter, and the output from the inverter is also patched into the input of this trigger. And that trigger is sent to a multiplier. And the other thing that's patched to the multiplier is the UI button. So when you hold this button here, a value of 1 is sent to a multiplier first pad, and a value of 1 is sent from the trigger on the second pad every time the value coming in is changing. And the way a multiplier works, it multiplies, as it might indicate. It does what it says on the tin. it multiplies these two values together, and then the output is the product of those two numbers. So when this button is pushed and when this thing is moved, then this will be 1 times 1. It will both get a value of 1 here, and it will output a value of 1. And that is sent to the trigger for the sample and hold that I mentioned earlier. So that means every time I increase or decrease the value of this encoder, when this is pushed down, then the sample and hold that is trying to maintain that value is triggered, and it will copy over the value continuously as long as this goes up and down. You can see it gets brighter and it gets darker, like so, and you can see the trigger here triggering both when it goes up and when it goes down. Sometimes this doesn't actually show because the light shining up is so brief that it doesn't actually light up. Occasionally you will see it, but it does trigger all the time, this multiplier, and that is what is causing this to increase and decrease and hold its value. So that's how that works. Now there's one more thing. I've explained most of it now actually already, but there's one more thing here, because you see there's an additional trigger module here that is patched to the UI button, and the output from this trigger is patched into the input here from, yeah, I still haven't said that actually, yes. So of course the value that is sent back to the Zoia now is, you want that to be the one that is from the active button. So what that does is you have the output from the sample and hold. It goes into the patch to control whatever you want, but also it goes into the respective channel on this in switch, which is what's sending the value back to the MIDI out as well. And so I have a channel 1 is of course not patched up to anything. That's the off state. And then you have channel 2 is button 1 and channel 3 is button 3. So on channel 2, you have the sample and hold CV output here. And that's the value that is then in on this channel. So when this channel selector, because of how that worked, I told you earlier, the connection strength selects this channel, is for channel 2, then that value held at channel 2 is sent to the output of this switch, and that is sent back to the MIDI controller. But there is one particular thing that can happen, because the way MIDI works is it only changes values, it only updates, I should say, when there is a value change. So if you have, I'll just zero these out. If you have both of these buttons now, and therefore both sample and holds set to 0, and you change the value of the encoder without pushing it, what happens when you push is it wouldn't zero out unless you send it something, because now you send it the value of 0, nothing happens. So if I remove this trigger, I'll just show you that now. So now I've got channel, so okay, I'm going to select something here on this, and look what happens now when I push button 1. Nothing, because it has a value of 0, and it's trying to send the value of 0 to something that already is the value of 0, which means there is no change, which means there's nothing being sent to the MIDI out, and so it just stays the value it already is. That's how that works. It needs to be a change. So the second button now still has its trigger. It's on the second page, and it zeroes it out like so. So I'm just going to undo that, bring back the trigger. And so what the trigger does now is that when you push this button, it goes to the trigger input, detects the rising value, sends out a pulse, and that is added to the value that's coming from the sample and hold here. But it goes up a little bit, and then it goes down again, because the trigger is just a very brief pulse. So you can see it flashing here, because now it's sending a MIDI value of 1, and it goes back to a MIDI value of 0. both of those are changes, and so it registers and it zeroes out if it was set anywhere like this. Now, this is something that isn't important, but this connection here is set to a connection strength of 1%. It could be 100, it doesn't actually matter, but if it were 100, then instead of getting that little flash at the beginning of the encoder, it would flash all the way to the top. So it's an aesthetic thing, which is better. I like that it's just a tiny little flash, and also if it's anywhere but if it's anywhere in between as well, it doesn't sort of suddenly flash to the top and then go back down again. So I like keeping this one at 1%. And that, my friends, is how this works. So it may not be the most useful thing in itself, but perhaps seeing how this is done, how this solves a problem or a challenge, I should say, is something that perhaps might inspire you to do some of your own patching, or it might actually lead you to the solution for something else you may have wondered how to do on the Zoia. And that's how you do it. So you can get 2 different values, or as many as you like, really, and it will be remembered on the Zoia, can be sent onwards from the sample and hold, and it will be sent back to the MIDI controller. There you go. Now, once previously, I did actually create a patch sheet for a patch I did because it was quite complex, but I thought just for the sake of tidiness and things, I should start doing that as a matter of course. So I did actually do a patch sheet for this particular patch as well, just to make a nice and tidy thing. And because I would like to have a collection of these patch sheets eventually, and perhaps put them in some book or something, but that'll be for the future. In any case, I don't have any web hosting right now, so the patch sheets and any other files that I will upload to be available will have to be on my Patreon, and they will be available, these ones, for the lowest tier as well. There will be more uploaded as I make them, and as I make more tutorials, or as I revisit old tutorials to make patch sheets for those too. Sometimes it's easier to... the thing is, if you have a patch on the Zoia downloaded from patch storage, you can look at it, you can analyze it, but sometimes it's a bit tricky to see exactly what's going on. So I think that having a patch sheet that shows you all the connections, connection strengths, all the modules, what goes where, makes it a lot easier to understand exactly how a patch works. And both for, actually, mostly for myself, I find that very useful when I'm trying to figure out how to do something I've done before, but I might have sort of, it's been a while, so I can't remember exactly how I did it. So patch sheet will be on Patreon. So anyway, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, please like, share, comment, subscribe, join me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, etc., etc., buy my poetry book, buy my music, buy my art, all those things, links below, and I'll see you in my next one. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye for now. Bye-bye.